Treasure ships usually yield gold, silver, and jewels, but the Jonkoping, a small Swedish ketch sunk by a German sub during World War I, was carrying an entirely different treasure, one that we think might really surprise you. The First World War was raging across the European continent. Although Sweden was neutral, there was a heavy trade of goods being smuggled across the Baltic to Finland, eventually destined for Russia. There was so much smuggling going on, the Germans kept a small fleet stationed in the Baltic for the express purpose of stopping the illicit trade. In October 1917, a small Swedish ketch, the Jönköping, slipped out of its home port in northern Sweden, headed for Rauma in Finland. In addition to the steel products she was carrying, there was also a very secret and unusual cargo. The Jönköping was smuggling champagne and cognac for the officers of the Imperial Russian Army.
There were supposedly 70 barrels of cognac. There were 50 packing cases, each containing 100 bottles of champagne, and 30 casks of Bordeaux wine on the manifest. And they had been sent from France to Sweden, and then they were being smuggled across the Baltic to the Russian army.
A German U-boat intercepted the Jönköping, removed her crew, and sank her with explosive charges. The ship and her cargo went to the bottom. And then, almost 80 years later, Claes Bergvall, a Swedish treasure hunter, decided to go after her.
The amount of cognac was 68 barrels, loaded with 5,000 gallons of cognac in different quality, from the absolute best down to, the scrap cognac.
You might have got 25,000 bottles out of that ship. Now, 25,000 bottles of cognac, which had been at the bottom of the sea for such a long time, would be a fantastic find.
Niklas Löfqvist is a Swedish journalist who covered the story.
When they tried to find out what they could do to get a ship up and what they could do with the champagne, if it was drinkable or the cognac, they went to the Vasa Museum and talked to the experts.
The Vasa, a 16th century Swedish ship of war which sank in Stockholm harbor, was brought to the surface 300 years later, demonstrating that wood can survive centuries of immersion in the Baltic. So there was every possibility the casks containing the cognac would be found intact. Claes Bergvall knew this was a treasure worth going after. The cognac in those barrels could be worth millions, perhaps tens of millions. While there was no evidence it was still drinkable after 80+ years on the bottom, the Jönköping's cargo was what dreams are made of.
The experts told them that champagne, 80 years old, could never drink that, forget it.
Yes, but it was the barrels of cognac that were the real treasure Bergvall was after.
There was a very big chance that they should have survived the storage at the bottom of the sea.
Bergvall and his partners knew that unlike most salvage operations, they would spend little time locating the ship. Bergvall had the U-boat captain's meticulously kept log, with coordinates showing where the Jönköping had been scuttled. The hard part was to be the recovery itself, because when they located the ship, she was not at the depth they expected. Instead of a very reachable 125 feet, the ship actually lay at a depth of almost 200 feet, and this changed everything.
So they had to go back to Sweden and find some people who could do this kind of diving, Trimix diving. Then you need 3 different kinds of gases to be able to work at that depth.
They found a diving team that specialized in the use of Trimix, a special blend of gases that enables divers working at great depths to return to the surface without suffering from the bends.
They had to rush from the diving elevator that took them up, get off all the clothes, rush into the compression chamber, right? And they had to spend 6 hours in the compression chamber.
Slow down. The work was slow and dangerous. The water temperature was freezing and there was little, if any, visibility. Only 15 minutes at a time could actually be spent at the sea bottom for exploration.
Everything okay? Okay.
So divers worked around the clock in an attempt to speed things up. Despite their best efforts, the salvers soon found themselves at a point where they believed they might not be able to get the job done.
We knew that the cost was going to be much higher because of the extra 75 feet of depth where we found the Jönköping. But suddenly it started to raise by 50% every time we went out, or sometimes even with 100%.
It was time for a new game plan. If the ship was too deep for the divers to get to, then bring the ship closer to the divers.
1 meter below the surface. This area has to be free so we can go underneath, so we are losing time right now.
They would tunnel under the hull and slip cables around her. Then a crane would be brought in to raise her off the bottom, bringing the Jönköping close to the surface where it would be easy for the divers to salvage her. When everything was ready, a giant floating crane was brought to the site in heavy seas and slowly maneuvered into position. Almost 100 feet high, the crane had never before been used in the open sea. If the weather suddenly changed while holding the full weight of the Jönköping, there was every chance she could capsize. And then, finally, the treasure for which they had set out was nearly at hand. The first barrels were raised from the wreck.
We started to see if we could get any of the barrels loose, and we brought something like 31 barrels up on deck. All of them were cognac barrels. We noticed that a few of these barrels were leaking heavily, and some of them were more intact. But I mean, we realized that the barrels were not in a very, very good condition.
The atmosphere on board darkened as the damage to the casks became evident.
They found that unfortunately the water had got through the wood and had effectively changed places with the cognac inside, and so the contents of all the barrels was completely spoiled.
After all the work, Berval found his hopes dashed. But they decided to carefully preserve the cognac in large plastic containers on the hope it could still be saved. Fearing a change in the weather, Berval didn't want to keep the wreck tied to the crane any longer than necessary. Divers were sent down for one last look before cutting her loose. And that's when they saw it. An open wooden box hidden behind some debris with bottles inside.
And they thought, well, you know, it's been down there 80 years, could never be intact. And then someone saw that there was some air in the bottle. And they realized, okay, if there's air in the bottle, that means there can't be salt water in the bottle. So they opened it up and tried the first champagne, and it was delicious.
We decided to taste it, and it was absolutely the experience of my life. You know, it was absolutely fantastic.
What the experts had told them was entirely wrong. The cognac, which was supposed to be perfect, was not, and the undrinkable champagne was excellent.
The extraordinary thing with this champagne was that it just hadn't changed. And the thing that matures wine more than anything is heat. And at 64 meters, it's 2 to 4 degrees centigrade all the year round.
This meant for perfect conditions for the champagne, because it was like having a wine cellar on the bottom of the Baltics.
While the giant crane continued to hold the Jönköping in place, the divers started bringing up the bottles. But even this was not to be without problems.
The problem was that as they brought the bottles up, the corks naturally would start to rise because the wires that hold the corks in at the top of the champagne had corroded away, they'd rusted and gone. Second, that the pressure at 64 meters in any ocean is almost exactly identical to the pressure inside a bottle of champagne, which is why you have a wire on the cork to stop it flying out. But the corks were exposed now.
And as the bottles rose, the water pressure holding the corks in place lessened, which is why the corks were loosening.
And they had this rather ingenious method that they put a wire mesh over the top of the cork with a tight wire around it to hold the cork in. Now, they had to act very fast, because as these bottles were coming up in a basket, maybe at 6 or 8 at a time, they had to be pretty fleet of hand to get this wire over the top of the cork, put a tough wire around to hold it on, and so secure the wine in the bottle.
The method succeeded. In just a couple of days, they managed to retrieve over 2,000 bottles of the champagne. When the divers could find no more bottles, Bergvall decided to bring the Jönköping to the surface. The sea was calm, and everyone wanted to see this small boat, the recovery of which had proved to be so difficult. The crane slowly winched the Jönköping to the surface and held her there. Divers carefully checked the ketch from bow to stern, making sure they had retrieved everything salvageable. Claes Bergvall had hoped they could tow the Jönköping back into harbor and preserve the little ship. But again, Baltic weather interfered, and they cut her loose before the weather could put the crane in jeopardy.
So we cut one of the wires and Jönköping disappeared, which was even a bigger disappointment for me than the knowledge of the cognac not being very good. So that was a traumatic experience for me to see Jönköping disappear into the depths of the Baltic once more.
So in the end, the big payoff turned out to be the champagne. It went to auction at Christie's in London, just before the millennium. A tasting was held prior to the auction, and the wine world was able to sample this perfectly preserved champagne for the very first time.
It was bright in color. It didn't smell as though anything had happened to it. It was really considerably sweet. It filled the mouth and remained after you had swallowed it.
All done at 2,000, 2,000 again, £2,000 for this.
The 1907 Piper Heidsieck sold for prices ranging from $2,500 to $4,000 a bottle. But while there were many buyers eager to have the champagne for millennium celebrations, there aren't as many who are now willing to pay those prices. So Bergvall and his partners keep the remaining bottles in a cold storage warehouse where the champagne continues to age, waiting for buyers who can afford it, at about $100 a sip. And the original French distiller that manufactured the cognac has now designed a process which can extract the seawater. So there are hopes it can be made drinkable and, of course, saleable. 3 years before, when Bergvall and his partners embarked on this recovery, they couldn't have foreseen the difficulties. The deep water diving, a stormy and unpredictable sea, raising the ship off the bottom, and in the end, a treasure entirely different from the one they went after. But Claes knows adversity is what treasure hunting is all about.
And that's the main incentive in doing this sort of work, is when you decide to go for something, then you go for it all the way. There's no midway leave or something like that. You have to do it from the beginning to the bitter end. There's no other way you can do it.